Hey guys, how's it going? I'm kvlt, your favorite lo-fi music YouTuber, and welcome to the fact that I am a liar. I'm sorry. I totally promised that I would have 14 albums reviewed by the first week of November, and then I got caught up, and then I put out the 100 Gex review, and then we're here. So basically, forget everything I said about a specific number of albums to review, but today we're going to cover the first 20 of the 60 albums, and then I'll probably have 2 more episodes out. Either way, by the first Sunday of December, I'll have this all covered, and this is a week in advance from that week, and I'm nearing the end of the list, so I'll have it done by then. But I've listened to a whole ton of stuff. I think today's albums aren't as interesting as later, because here we just have the first 20, and it's a pretty mixed bag here. I still think there's some pretty interesting listens. I mean, I really only picked things that looked interesting from a distance, because I think you guys are going to notice by the sheer amount of NSBM albums that I really didn't dive into these that much. And I used to not have guilt about listening to NSBM, because, and if you guys don't know, that's I can't really say it on YouTube, I don't believe, but it's I'll just say alternative political views for these bands, and I don't get political on this channel, that's not my thing. But the thing is, there are a shocking amount of them. Either ways, for NSBM, I normally don't care that much, because I don't buy it. I'm pretty make sure that I listen to it. Anyway, the artist does not actually benefit from me listening to it, which I can appreciate their musical efforts or a general vibe of what they're going for, but I don't like their message. But once I went through half of this list, I was like, there are more NSBM albums on here than I would have preferred. It's under 10, I'm pretty sure, but I have 60 albums total here. I totally digress here because I just wanted to get that out of the way. If it looks like there are a lot of NSBM albums, Mew was just feeling away when I was picking their albums, and then I put it in here. Speaking of NSBM, the first release here, Drowning the Light, The Longing. This is a compilation record. It's a really long one, but I think we're off to a very strong start for Nothing But Black Metal November. So we get a combination of some of the most raw black metal possible, with really interesting dungeon synth forming the main instrumental for this whole release here. And I gotta say, this formula works excellently. It's drony, it's hypnotic, the repetition never feels like it's out of place. It works super well, and especially for a compilation, this release feels surprisingly consistent. It's pretty much like Paysage d'Hiver type raw, by the way. If you're not into the really raw stuff of black metal, you won't like this. I also gotta say, the vocals here are ferocious, and the 20-minute haunting of the black aristocracy is absolutely hypnotic. It is super repetitive, and there's a point around the 12-minute mark or so that it changes, and then it goes back into the whole thing that it was doing before, and it works super well, and I'm surprised at how good it sounds despite how repetitive and hypnotic it is. I feel like this is great. This is not a very accessible black metal release. One, because I know a lot of music listeners use Spotify mainly. You can pretty much only find this on YouTube or some other off the beaten path streaming websites. But this is a very strong, raw, very, very cult release. So I highly recommend a listen. Up next, we have Sargeras with Let the Devil In. This is the complete opposite of The Longing. This is a very fast listen here. It's very to the point, not very raw at all. I'd honestly say the production's decent here, but unfortunately that is actually kind of a detriment in terms of this, because and that's not just of me being an elitist in terms of black metal tradition. It's just raw production tends to suit it better. I find it actually sounds better with the guitars and the drumming typically, and it's lightning fast here. It's almost Norsecore kind of ideas. I think the vocals are really wretched and sinister, and there's a bit of a melodic edge to the guitars, which is a really nice touch. And the riffs are pretty decent overall, but honestly, this album's pretty generic, and maybe it's just because I'm looking at this after listening to, honestly, 100 different black metal albums that came out in 2021 that probably were influenced by Sargeras, but from my perspective, it just doesn't do that much that makes it different. Also, there are some bits on this album that are more eerie, a little more ominous, that actually make it a lot more enjoyable overall, and I think those are the parts that really make it, I guess, sort of separate from other black metal releases. But I think this is a good album. If you want something that's under the greats here, totally listen to Sargeras. And after that, we have a somewhat similar album, Ara Noir, with Black Thrash Attack. The bassist of Ara Noir, Apollyon, was in several Immortal albums, so if you like Immortal, you can never tell what the bass playing is on Immortal, so you're not really gonna like care about Ara Noir's bass playing, but it is the same guy. And this is lightning fast, fiery, thrashy black metal. This is black thrash, so you are gonna get really to the point, semi-melodic, aggressive black metal, probably with some guitar solos. And the production's actually rather unique on this album. It's not the most raw, but the way it all sounds is super claustrophobic. It's literally like it's all suffocating you. And the atmosphere surprisingly shines through a bit. Also, there's a pretty interesting array of cymbals on the drum kit, a lot of textures that I don't typically hear on black metal albums. And there are great drum parts in general. It reminds me of Horg from Immortal, which, I mean, Immortal stuff is kind of black thrash anyway, so it kind of makes sense to have that. But the drumming is awesome. And it's not the most emotional release, but it's got some excellent riffs and some really talented playing overall here. So I think this is another good album. Moving on to our first popular band's less popular pick here. This is Darkthrone with Panzerfaust. I did get a comment last time saying that Panzerfaust wasn't that much of a less popular Darkthrone release. That is true. It is probably their top, 5 or 6 most listened to album, but it's not the main 3. When you think of Darkthrone, you think of the 3 Corpse Paint albums released in the 90s that really was a flagship for black metal, that really made black metal into its own style, away from death metal, into something raw and wretched, and it turned it from fiery into more ominous and dark, which is a feeling that's much more familiar to black metal, because fiery is less second wave and much more like Bathory or Celtic Frost. Anyways, Panzerfaust is actually a lot like Darkthrone's 2021 album, if you guys ever listened to that, which I actually thoroughly enjoyed, which means I'll enjoy this too. A lot of heavy, slower riffing here, and a lot of diversity in the album, which, coming off the heels of Transylvanian Hunger, that's actually rather interesting, because Transylvanian Hunger is a pretty repetitive album. It really took that style and ran with it, and in a way perfected it, but here you get something a little bit more diverse. And straight off the bat, from the first track, you get these gorgeous guitar sound that is just ice cold from the layers of the guitar in the mix. It sounds amazing. And the production of the vocals fits in as well. It all makes it sound very desperate and almost like kind of inching towards what DSBM might become in the future. I'm not really sure. I don't have that pinned down exactly, but I think this could have possibly given some influence. The song Triumphant Gleam is very thrashy, and it has actually some pretty excellent atmosphere too, so that balance is really impressive. The song Behold the Throne of Night is, in my opinion, just okay, but the thing is, the entire rest of the album is great, so I think this is an album that is great overall. Our next album, and another NSBM album, and the first one I've listened to that I didn't actually love, is Grand Belial's Key with Kosherat. This one's kind of interesting because it's American. So as you can tell, all the themes of this album revolve around Judaism. So totally understand if you want to skip it. I never really bit into the philosophy of this album because it was just kind of like hateful in a way that I couldn't even get with. It wasn't like a general hatred or even that aggressive, honestly. And here's the thing with Kosherat. I don't love it as much as everyone else does. Everyone seems to love Kosherat, but I actually listened to a bit of Mocking the Philanthropist, and I liked it more. I think the riffs were better, and the production was better overall. This album's pretty solid, but it's not Mocking the Philanthropist. It's very interesting, and it's pretty noisy sounding, but everyone talks about them having all these heavy metal influences that are away from black metal. Who cares, honestly? They're still straightforward black metal. The only genre you can describe them as is black metal. They don't have enough influences that are crazy enough on this album to really be oh, it's blackened thrash, it's blackened heavy metal. It's not really a thing. But none of the influences really shine through as much as people think. I think it's interesting how the drumming takes a bit of a back seat. It's not as much blast beats, which would kind of make some climaxes of the tracks work a little bit better, which it does do. I will say that this album's actually a bit progressive sounding. It's never that repetitive. And there are a whole bunch of like industrial style guitar tricks, like slides and pitch harmonics and all those things that do give the guitars a bit of extra body. But in 2021, that's really not as impressive as it sounds, because there are plenty more releases even on this list that do something like that. Overall, I think Kosher Rat's a good album. I don't think it's great, but I mean, you could totally give it a pass, and you'd probably be fine with whatever black metal you're listening to. Up next, we have our first re-listen, and this is a war metal album. This is Blasphemy with Fallen Angel of Doom. I used to not like this album. I gave it an okay about a year ago when I covered the big black metal chart, and I will say my opinion switched entirely after listening to a whole lot more black metal. I finally can appreciate the direct approach of this album, how utterly oppressive and aggressive it is. It is not the most violent sounding war metal album out there, especially with stuff like Malgoth's album that came out this year, but it is a flagship of the genre, and it's an excellent example of it. And it is super lo-fi. The whole A side of this album is so raw that it is a bit of a detriment, and that was my issue the first time I listened to it. It's that you could barely pick out the riffs. They're all very typical like Norsecore style riffing, but like lower and a bit faster, and just really heavy overall. And the vocals people have described more as death growl style vocals, but they actually have a bit of a breathy quality to them too that makes them seem like a little bit mysterious, which I think kind of helps it deviate from the typical death metal death growls. Not that interesting, but I find that pretty interesting myself. And I will say one of my favorite parts about the sound of this album as a whole is that the bass works really well in conjunction with the kicks on the drums, which is really strong, and the snare also snaps really nicely. I think the song Ritual has a really nice heavy metal style groove that really makes the song probably the highlight of the album. It's the most different song, and it is the most interesting. And I just think the atmosphere of this album actually shines through rather well. That makes it truly stand out as a black metal release rather than a death metal release. Of course, you can get into semantics and say, oh, it's war metal, so it's neither, but I disagree. I really do think it's black metal, but it's war metal. Up next, we get an EP. This is Grave Flowers with the Hyacinth Garden. This is on Bandcamp, and it's some group from Portland, Oregon. And first look at that, and first look at this album, I had low hopes. I really didn't think it was going to be good. And what I got treated to was actually one of probably the best EP I've ever heard in my life, and I'm not joking. This is utterly an unforgiving, emotional, just onslaught. It wastes 0 seconds. It is pretty fast, but in terms of raw, it does not get more raw than Grave Flowers, the Hyacinth Garden. It has the most aggressive and abrasive sound I've ever heard. If you don't have like Audio Technicas or a good pair of headphones, you won't hear a single note. It actually will sound like static. But if you listen to it with this, you get just the most emotionally unforgiving album, EP rather, that I've ever heard. And it is a very strong release. The song The Violet Hour has this much less noisy part in the middle that really brings out the emotions, because it's like when you're super, super mad and then you calm down out of nowhere and then you realize like all this damage you've done. A really interesting emotional bit there. The song April is the Cruelest Month is almost like early period Swans level of unforgiving in terms of the sound. It's like atmospheric, but also like just destructive. Like it's genuinely unnerving. And I'm surprised something this good, or anything good at all, could come out of Portland, Oregon. But you know what? This is certainly amazing. This is a great release. And up next, we have a blackened death metal album here, Skeleton Witch with Devouring Radiant Light. This album is a bit more hi-fi than other stuff, but if you get past that, you realize it's a good melodic blackened death metal release with some really solid riffs. Unfortunately, the melodies themselves aren't that gripping, but the guitar solos, which is probably one of my favorite things about blackened death metal, they're really strong here. They're really technical and progressive sounding, and they add a lot of emotion and especially some extra just body to the album as a whole. Also, the whole second half of the album has a lot of emotion to it, so that's all just very strong in total. I think Black and Death is a little flawed as a genre, especially when it's not war metal. But I think Skeleton Witch did a good job. It's a good album. Up next, we have Torture Chain with Mutilating Astral Entities. I said this was from China. Actually think it's from the United States. I looked into it. I got no indication that they were from China. And this is a Dark Throne ripoff, a Panzerfaust ripoff, and not a very good one at that. It is one with 10-minute plus tracks. They are just super repetitive and not that gripping in the first place. The guitar tones are kind of flat. The interludes are cool, I guess. And honestly, it's just not a very active listen. That being said, I don't hate this album. I think it's okay, but just kind of a weak one for me, honestly. Next, we have Wyrd with Huldra Folk. First thing is, their 2021 album was also pretty solid. I give it like an 8 out of 10. I thought it was kind of one note, kind of one-dimensional, and honestly, just like kind of cheesy sounding, but also like it kept me very entertained, and it sounded good. So I can't really complain that much. But Huldra Folk is the superior of the two albums. It's folky and doomy black metal. If you have listened to Peste Noir's debut and you're like, gosh, I need something that sounds like this, that isn't fascist in nature, then check these guys out. Check out Wyrd, Wyrd, with Huldra Folk. It's got pretty much the same textures from what I remember. It has been a while since I listened to Peste Noir. I think the title track is very fiery, and it's just a really good example of some energetic black metal. And the whole thing here is just meditative, and it sounds great overall. Like, honestly, just a super solid release. I think this is great as well. And after that, we have Life Lover with their album Erotic. The thing about this is I'm not going to disqualify it, but I almost did, because it almost feels like post-punk. Not that there's anything wrong with post-punk, it's just not allowed in this month. But it's just a solid album. It's very emotional, but if you want your black metal to have a lot of good bass riffs that are relatively simple yet really easy to track, you will enjoy Erotic. It's very densely produced as well. The guitar is very, very fuzzy, which is at some points to its detriment, but normally to its advantage. Some songs like Museum of Past Affection really highlights the riff, and that's honestly the album at its strongest. All right, I'm feeling nice, so I'm not DQing this, but I think it's a good album. I've heard the entire rest of Life Lover's discography is better than Erotic, but I think like Encyclopedia Metallum ranked Erotic the highest, so that's probably why I picked it all that time ago. But I'll probably check out their other stuff in the future. Anyway, up next is Ballada by Varmia. This is a recent release, and it's probably one of like 150 different black metal promotion albums I've listened to this year. And I gotta be honest, I was sick and tired of black metal promotion towards the end of it. I listened to so much of their stuff that I was really just like, I can't handle another 34-minute Norse core piece that's like well produced with the most boring atmospheric riffs. Even the atmospheric black metal albums this year were bad from black metal promotion. Some of the albums that they said were good. Anything Black and Doom was solid, especially the new Ruins of Beverast. Everyone listen to the new Ruins of Beverast, please. Actually, black metal promotion didn't shout that one out, so scratch that. So this album actually has a lot of folk influence. It actually kind of reminds me a bit of the folk parts of Enslaved. It's also certainly death metal tinged. The atmosphere doesn't always hit, but the songs themselves have some pretty solid variety. One of my favorite parts is the song, I think, Ruha. It has this riff that turns into this huge drone, and it's one of the strongest parts in the album. And I think the drone, it goes on for a really long time, but it's really cool. And this kind of goes together with how the album is good when it's hypnotic. When it's hypnotic, it is phenomenal. It really knows how to stick this in. But it doesn't always have that. It's more melodic. Riffy parts aren't as good. And I will say the melodic parts aren't melodic enough. If they were actually more melodic and had a more gripping line, I would probably take this album from a good to a great. But for now, it's good. Up next, to offset all the NSBM on my chart, we have a communist black metal album. Yeah. Soyuz, Red Blood, White Frost. And the thing about this is it's not even like political. It's just about the Red Army in World War II. It's a historical album. So this is for the nerds, I guess. Not that black metal is not for nerds. We're all kind of nerds here if you listen to black metal. No disrespect. I listen to black metal. We're nerds though. So the sound of this album is very solid. It's super lo-fi and crunchy and snowy and thick. In my opinion, it's a bit too smothered, but I mostly dig it. After the first track, all the riffs become a bit more melodic, which I think is pretty solid. But then we get the biggest flaw in the album, the vocals. And I know this happens sometimes on other albums, but here I could not tell that there were vocals until I realized that there was a sound of wind. And I was like, that's kind of odd that it's the only sound here and that it keeps stopping. Granted, I've heard other raw black metal albums where the vocals kind of sound like wind at points, but here they sound like wind the whole time. Those are the vocals. They're the wind. And I was like, oh, that's not really what I want to hear. It's not really a texture that really builds anything on top of this, unfortunately. But this album is honestly solid. I think it's a good album. A bit of a novelty, but it's strong. And after that, we have Carpathian Forest with Black Shining Leather. This album gets a lot of flack for being black and roll. I have no issue with black and roll. Last year, I really loved that one black and roll album that I can't remember right now, which is kind of funny. But I don't have an issue with the genre inherently. I think it's been done really well a few times. Not like Satiricon's late stuff. Not that. Just there are other albums that are good, not Satiricon's later stuff. But this style is really black and angry, which is honestly really nice. And the bass is really prominent on the song The Swordsman, which has a really nice heavy metal feel too, which I think is a very strong addition to the track list. Honestly, if you like the way Grand Belial's Key is described, then you're probably going to like the best of black and roll, which is going to be Shining Black Leather. It's going to be Carpathian Forest. So listen to this because it's great. Next we have Flamin with Furor Lunae. This album was kind of under the radar for some reason. Well, it's a good reason. It's because it's not that good. But honestly, I didn't know why I found it, but someone was like, wow, you got to listen to this. So I threw it on the list. You get a lot of medieval sort of folk isms on this album. A lot of different instrumentation that sounds very medieval. So if that's something you're into to a high degree, then you'll probably love this. But the rest of the album was just kind of whatever. The guitar tone is interesting, but it's not necessarily one that I love. In my opinion, the best parts of this album were when there were horns and like less guitar, because the guitar is really just not that interesting. I think this album's okay. If you are dying for some medieval folkisms in your black metal, then sure, listen to it, but don't get mad at me if you don't love it. And after that, we have another popular band's less popular pick. This is Bursum with Fallen. Up to this point, I've listened to every black metal, every album up until Varg's Prison Time and the two Dungeon Synth Prison Time albums. And then after the one black metal album, after he got out, then is Fallen. I've listened to that, and how do I feel about it? Unfortunately, it takes a lot of things Varg was strong with. It takes really solid melodic guitar lines. Unfortunately, it makes the songs too long. They're great, honestly, but like the way he mixes the bass and the guitar, the bass is honestly pretty much playing the same notes. He's playing it really high up, and it's not giving it any bottom end. If you don't care about bottom end in your music, like that's probably fine. But I think black metal should have like drums with bass accompanying it for the bottom end. Here, it's all kind of top end, and then it gets boring after a while. But I will say, Varg's clean singing here is not that bad. I actually kind of like it. Yegfaller especially is a strong track. It's the opening track. In fact, the first, fifth, and seventh tracks are all really stellar. Those are all really great. Also, this album has no synths. Not a single synth. At least on the black metal tracks, there aren't any synths, which I was like, really? Varg, come on. Like, I love Bursum's synth and black metal output. Like, everything on Philosophem sounds amazing because of the synths being added in. So, I think this album's good, but it was a little disappointing. Next, we have Fen with Epoch. This is a black gaze album, and therefore I disqualified it. It's mostly like black metal tinged, but it kind of dips too much into the post-rock stuff. But the guitar is soaked in delay, and that's kind of how it tries to be fuzzy and black metal-like, which is a really interesting idea. I just think it could be executed better. Also, it's really moody stuff, and the bass has some really nice presence. There are a lot of post-rock influence here, especially because there are a lot of violent peaks that actually sound pretty great, especially with the guitar. I will say the song Half-Light Eternal, it was really good to me. But the album as a whole was good. Of course, it is disqualified from Nothing But Black Metal November, so let's just pretend like it never happened. And up next is another re-listen, Tormentor with Anno Domini. This album is important because it's the first album Attila was on, the first full length, that is. Attila from Mayhem and Sun O, if you don't know how it's actually pronounced, the infamous drone metal outfit. And how is this album? Attila's vocals are a little different here. They're not as grand. They're a lot more wretched. But I think this album is much more novelty over substance. And it's a good bridging point between first and second wave black metal. Like they didn't know English that well quite yet. Thrash metal was a huge influence still, but it does go a little more atmospheric and a little more evil. I will say the riffs are sick though. They're super melodic, but it's kind of fun black metal is the thing. So if you're into the campy fun side of black metal, which is some first wave stuff, then you will probably love this, especially like the opening to Elizabeth Bathory. Like the whole like spoken word section is just silly. And if you want more atmospheric first wave black metal that you can take a little more seriously, I recommend Sarcophago or Celtic Frost, but this is still good. Like it is essential for black metal. Like you kind of need it to understand the progression, but in terms of a listen on its own, it's a good album. Next, we have Nicoquin with Heart of a Caimon. This is a really interesting USBM pick that has a lot of Native American folk influence, actually, and it's a really interesting album for that. It can kind of be paired with bands like Panopticon that are known for American music influence rather than strictly like European style, but it's kind of where USBM goes into like three different paths. It's like the cringy, I'm super progressive, look at how good my music is. That's like Wolves in the Throne Room, and I guess Liturgy. Wolves in the Throne Room I do consider to be black metal. I just don't think they're very good. I think they're like okay. And then you've got the DSBM side, Leviathan and Disaster, and then you've got the folk stuff, which is Panopticon and I guess Nicoquin here. Nicoquin does a great job on this album. It is not boring for one single second. Between the acoustic riffs and the really amazing melodic electric guitar riffs, it all is very entertaining. The extra drums plus the double kicks gives it a really full sound. I think that's one of the strongest parts texturally, is that the drumming is so full, and it honestly makes it really oppressive and almost violent, which makes it just really just pounding. It's a really good album to bang your head to. Also, there are a lot of guitar solos that are really well done, just in general. The song Skyhook, for being mostly instrumental, is actually really strong and very emotional, which I can always appreciate. So this album's great, honestly. Don't let the weird kind of album cover sort of knock you. It just looks kind of like basic Photoshop PNG over the stuff, like my thumbnails. But it's a great album, honestly. And the last album we're covering today is another war metal album. This is Antichrist with Sacrament of Blood. Here's the thing about this album. So the album cover is not very good, but more importantly, this is a ripoff of Blasphemy. Not even derivative. It sounds like Blasphemy. Except it's less raw. It's just like, it's still raw, but it's not like cloudy and abrasive sounding, and it's like you can barely hear the guitar. It's just raw, and it's just less interesting that way, which the riffs actually come across as hypnotic and rather interesting because you can hear them more, but it's kind of it's not a trade-off that I really like. The song Unholy Devourment just pounds away, which actually kind of makes it one of my favorite tracks on the album here. I think it's pretty strong overall. So this album doesn't do anything interesting at all. Like, if you've listened to another war metal album, particularly Fallen Angel of Doom, then you know this album. It's nothing new. That being said, if you like war metal, you will enjoy this. It's a solid album. I think it's good. Just super, super, super derivative, which is a common thing of war metal, but hopefully you'll find some stuff that's different. But that's about it. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys enjoyed these 20 albums. I hope you guys will come back next week when I cover 40 more. But that's about it. Hope you guys enjoyed Nothing But Black Metal November. What are some albums you listen to? There are a lot of interesting ones this year. And that's about it. Hope you guys are doing well. Go ahead and join my social medias down below. Join the Discord server. Hit the like button, subscribe. But that's about it. Hope you have a good one. Bye.